So many of you know that I'm a sixth grade teacher, and sixth graders are really interesting age group. There's lots of little quirks, and they're very funny, especially at the beginning of the year. There's lots of really funny stories with sixth graders because they're nervous about coming into middle school, and so I've learned through the years that you don't need a lot of rules. You really need about like 5, 6 main rules, and then those can encompass a lot of little laws or rules for your classroom. And so I've learned over the years it's much easier to do that than have to, like, say, have 20 different rules. And so one of the rules that I changed over the years was gum. I used to always say, okay, you can't have any gum. And I was always policing that. And I always felt like for kids, that was kind of like this challenge of, oh, he says no gum, so we're going to try to break that, So every year now, I just say, hey, you can chew gum as long as it's not a problem in the classroom. As long as it's not disturbing the class, it's not a problem. And for the most part, it works out well because most sixth graders aren't that much into chewing gum anyway, so it's usually not too big a deal. So this year I said the same little spiel. I said, hey, you can have gum in the classroom. As long as it's not a problem. And so after I got over going over rules, this little boy named Harold comes up, and Harold was all excited about this rule. He's like, oh, my mom's going to she's going to love this rule because I have ADHD, and this gum really helps me focus. And he says, oh, she's going to be really happy. I said, well, great. And he said, well, I got a couple questions for you. He said, do you prefer I have bubble gum or or other kinds of gum? And I was like, said, just talk about this with your mom, whatever makes most sense. He goes, well, what would be a disturbance like? Sometimes I accidentally pop my gum. Is that a disturbance? And I was like, well, yeah, but I'll have some grace with you. I'll tell you if you're getting too loud with your gum. And what if it falls on my paper while I'm chewing? Would that be a disturbance? And so he's asking me all these questions about gum. And I'm thinking, wow, why? Now I wish I didn't even have this rule in place, right? Because this is going a little overboard. So then the next day, he asked me all these questions. The next day, he literally brings me it's almost like this little briefcase-like thing that had all these different types of gum in here. He says, well, my mom wanted me to show you this, and he's got types of gum. Which would you prefer me to have? And I said, I don't really care which, unless you are going to be offering to bring me some every week, then maybe I will have some choice. Want to have some choice in that. So the gum thing was funny, and it's one thing that makes me think about is the fact, though, that we all want to know the rules, right? So Harold wanted to know the rules very explicitly, but most of us want to know, okay, what's the bottom line? What is it that we have to do to get what we want? Like when we get our driver's license. I remember my first time taking that test, I just wanted to know what was the minimum score required to pass. That's all I want to know. What was the bottom line? And that's how most of us are. We want to know the rules, the parameters, what's the bottom line. And so we're going to be looking today at the old Jewish laws, and for them, they want to know the bottom line. But what happened is the Pharisees, or the religious leaders of that time period, also added on to the rules quite a bit. Kind of like Harold wanted to know all these specifics about my gum policy. The Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, had added it on lots of extra rules that made it actually even more complicated than what the original laws or rules were intended to do. So today we're going to go, this is the second part of just a short series Shalane started last week that's called Upgrade. And so the ideas of it, she talked about last week how for Upgrade, Jesus comes along during the Sermon on the Mount, and he comes to the people and says, you've heard it said, but I'm going to tell you what I think about this law. He takes it to a new standard, so it's an upgrade. So she talked about last week how it's kind of like an upgrade to our phones. We get a little upgrade, and so and that happens here in the Sermon on the Mount, this little upgrade that Jesus brings to 6 different things. Last week, she talked about murder and adultery and divorce, and she was a great message. I'm glad she didn't leave those ones for me to talk about, but go back and listen to those. It's a really good message about those and the grace that God has in each of those situations. So, but again, we like to have checklists. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, they like to have checklists. But again, they had these minimum standards that they added onto and became more and more difficult to follow them and almost impossible to follow. So that's where Jesus comes along and where we're going to be today in the Sermon on the Mount. So we're going to start in Matthew 5, and we're going to be going through verses 33 through 48. And so in your bulletin, there's a little place for you to take notes. So on the back of your bulletin, if you'd like to take some notes, there's a space for you to do that. And you can have your Bibles out for where we're going over some scripture. If you have a little device to use to read, that's fine. But we also will have the scriptures up here on the overhead as well. So we're first going to focus on verses 33 through 37. So Matthew 5, 33 through 37. And this is on oaths. It says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair black or white. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one.'" And so your first point on your bulletins is be honest all of the time. That's your first point. So this stems from, we go back to some verses in the Old Testament. First of all, Leviticus 19:12 says, "Do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." And then we have Exodus 20, verse 7 says, "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name." And so, growing up, I often, and I think a lot of us think of that, misusing Jesus' name, we think about, or God's name, we think about using it as a swear word or using it inappropriately. But a lot about what this was not making pledges in God's name or promises in God's name if you're not going to keep them, how important that was. And so over the years, though, what happened, the Jewish people had developed customs of swearing to the truth, and they developed lots of different customs through this year, so where they actually put qualifications on truth. So I'm going to read to you, if you'll turn to Matthew 23, verse 16 through 22. We're going to show you another spot here where Jesus confronts some of the Pharisees about this practice. So verse 16 says, "Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men! Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it." So the Pharisees had differentiated between swearing by the temple or the altar, neither of those which obligated them to fulfill their vow, if you can imagine that. That if they swore by those two things, they didn't necessarily have to fulfill this vow. And then by the gold or the offering, which did obligate them to. So they had these different levels of truth. So Jesus comes along and says, hey, we're getting rid of this whole, we don't even need to do this oath thing. Let your yes be your yes and your no be your no. And I know when I first read about this years ago, I was like, this is kind of ridiculous. Why would they make up these different levels of truth? Why would they even come up with these different ways of swearing an oath? And then as I think about it now, though, I think we do a lot of similar kind of things. Okay? We also put stipulations around our honesty. So think about a couple of these phrases I'm going to throw out to you. Somebody says to you, to be perfectly honest with you. Okay? Now, if they say that, now when people say it to me, I'm like, aren't you always honest with me? I'm hoping you're always honest with me. Or, hey, come over here. I need to tell you something off the record. And you're saying, okay, so how many, we've all heard that, and we've probably, some of us been guilty of that. I know I have before. So you hear that and you go, okay, so interesting. And then to be blunt with you. And again, it's like, don't you want to always be blunt with somebody? Or, when you're little kids, you do the little pinky promise thing, right? And so we sometimes promise somebody, hey, we're really telling the truth this time. Or I'm gonna level with you. Or this time I'm gonna shoot just straight from the hip. All right? So again, we're putting stipulations. Or you might say, yeah, I told a little lie. It was just a white lie. It didn't really harm anything. Or I was mostly truthful. I'm guilty of that one. Schlang catches me on that sometimes because I don't like confrontation. So I might just not maybe leave out a few little details here and there. Okay. All right. So unfortunately, we're in a world right now where we're getting a lot of this. We have our news, and you're hearing a lot about the fake news and what's going on in politics. And I think both sides are guilty of this, but what you're seeing is it's becoming acceptable to twist the news or to shape it to whatever we want it to be. You watch the news and they might leave out something really important, or they might completely exaggerate it because now they're trying to twist everything, and there's this bias here where they're trying to, instead of report the news, they're trying to get a message across to you. All right? And it's happening a lot. And I think we're beginning to get jaded because we don't know anymore what's truthful and what's not. And I really feel sorry for our younger age group. I think of these younger kids who are growing up, and it's sad to think this is what they're going to be used to. They're going to be used to this and not even knowing what's true and not true, and have this jaded opinion of, does truth even matter, right? So truth has become very relative in our society. And, it's easy for us to criticize the news, okay? But how many of you have heard somebody brings you a kind of a gossipy story, and maybe it's about a celebrity or somebody that you don't care that much for, and they tell you this story? Well, you can't wait to go tell somebody else what you've just heard, and you go in there and exaggerate or make it more dramatic than it really was, or you leave out something really important in it that maybe this person wasn't as guilty as that it might appear, right? So we leave things out. We do the same thing, right? I think we've all been guilty of that little exaggeration. So again, Jesus said, let your yes be a yes and your no be a no. So why is this important? Why is that even such a big deal? Well, one thing to think about is we right here in this room, if you accepted Christ and you're a Christian, you're the bearer of God's word. Okay, we're to go out and tell people about Jesus. And if we are somebody who's not truthful, how can people really trust us? If somebody says, well, he's always telling little lies, and I don't really believe anything he says, and that person invites you to church to hear about Jesus, you're saying, I don't really know if I really buy into what he says because he doesn't seem to have a lot of honesty. Or, man, she gossips all the time. She's always talking about so-and-so or somebody else, and she wants me to believe in Jesus. I'm not sure, right? So I think for us as Christians, is we live in a world that desperately needs to hear about Christ, but if we're not credible, that's a problem. So our credibility is really crucial. So we need to be honest all the time, not just when it suits us. And you think about your relationship with Christ, we'll also have a much more fulfilling relationship with Christ if we're able to be honest with him. And I think the reason why a lot of us do lie is I think there's this tendency that we want to impress others, right? We want to have this facade. And I think deep down, there's a fear that somebody might really find out who I really am. So what happens is we try to look perfect and we cover things up. So lying is not only just this verbally saying something inaccurate, it also going to be that we're trying to cover ourselves up and not let everybody else know what's going on in our lives, right? So we have this facade because we have this fear of others. So I think we've all probably felt that a little bit, like I want to cover something up. I don't want somebody to know this about me or that about me, right? So if you think about your relationship with God, if we can't be honest with him, if we can't be honest with ourselves, then it's going to be much harder for the Holy Spirit and his power to work through us if we're not an open book. And so for us to have this great relationship with God, we really need to work on being honest people. So it's very simple. Let your yes be a yes and your no be a no. Don't add or detract from that. So we probably, I know if you're like me, you could probably go home right now and have plenty to work on just on this part of this message. But my wife did ask me to preach the rest of this scripture. So we are going to go on, right? There's probably quite a lot for right in that little bit for all of us. But next part is in, we're going to look at 5 verses 38 through 42. And this section is, for your notes, go the extra mile. So I'm going to read starting at verse 38. And most of your Bibles will probably says an eye for an eye right there. So verse 38 says, you have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. And I've heard a lot of people say this is one of the most difficult scriptures of the Bible for them, right? This is a hard one. So what is it? What does this all mean? So first of all, let's just talk for a second, eye for an eye, okay? So where does that come from? So the eye for an eye is, it's sometimes also the Latin term lex talionis, means the law of retaliation. But it's also been called the ending of feuds. And we see an eye for an eye not only with the ancient Hebrews and their practices, but also the Mesopotamians and Hammurabi's code and the Babylonians. A lot of the societies back then had some principles of an eye that are similar to an eye for an eye. All right? And so the idea, though, one of the ideas of this law was actually based on the idea of fairness, not the idea of retaliation. And back in ancient times, this was really important because there weren't that many courts. It's not like our society today where courts are just such a big part of our society, right? There weren't that many courts. And so what would happen is a lot of times people would take the principle of retaliation into their own hands. There was kind of this Hatfield-McCoy's mentality that I'll take this man, or whatever happened, I'm gonna settle on my own, right? A good example of that is if you look in Genesis 48 and 49, there's the story of Dinah. And Dinah, it's a very sad story where she is raped. And her brothers, Simeon and Levi, decide they're going to get revenge for this. So they do. And not only do they get revenge by killing the men who raped Dinah, but they also went and killed a whole town full of men. I mean, wiped out this whole town. So it was violence as a way of getting back, but it was over the top, right? Instead of saying, here should be the consequence, they took the consequence in their own hands, and it went on and on, right? So that was the problem. So this eye for an eye, or lex talionis as it was called, was added to the Jewish law to prevent this unlimited or unfair retaliation. The injured person could then go to a governing authority and seek justice, and the punishment was meant to fit whatever the crime was, to be fair. So it's a proportional legal system, okay? And then once it's finished, the idea was, okay, we have this consequence, now it's finished. You go on with your life. You don't go on getting more vengeance, okay? But over time, the law that was designed to prevent actions of personal retaliation and revenge actually became a way to justify it. So people would say, well, he said this, so I'm going to go say this to him. Or she did this, so I'm going to go do this back to her, right? So it became an excuse for getting back at people for even minor offenses. One thing I want you to really notice in this passage is the kind of examples that Jesus gives. These are not, I'm going to say not, situations dealing with threatening crimes, violent crimes, crimes of bodily maiming or murder. Those crimes had specific consequences within the Jewish law. Okay, those consequences were set. So this is not in response to something that's done violently to you. And sometimes people will also try to say this is a case for pacifism or capital punishment. Okay? So if you look at the Bible and you look at the whole view of the Bible, you realize, no, that's not the case, because there's times where the Jewish people are going to war. There's times where there was called upon for capital punishment. So it's not applying to those things, at least in my opinion. I think a lot of scholars would agree with that. So the examples that Jesus gives are examples where people are offended. They're insults. These are personal situations. But again, the people of Jesus' time had taken the idea of an eye for an eye into play in even the smallest of offenses. So look at a couple examples. I want to talk about just a couple of examples here that Jesus uses. Mike, would you come up here just a second here? I hate to do this to you, but okay, yeah. So you can stand right there. It's fine. Yeah. So I'm going to use Mike to demonstrate. Yeah, just stand right here. Yeah. Okay. So the idea of slapping the cheek and then turn your other cheek. Okay. So I knew I picked the right guy for this. All right. Okay. Oh, Lonnie, you want to come and volunteer, right? Okay. All right. So one of the things to understand about this culture, this time period, to slap somebody like this was not referring to a fighting situation. Respect and honor was very important to these people. So this was in situations of honor or respect. And one of the things that I found was interesting, you were not supposed to slap somebody with your left hand. And the left hand was considered dirty and inappropriate for using for any kind of slapping like that. So you couldn't use your left hand. So it says that if you get hit in the right cheek, so if I'm going to hit Mike in the cheek, I'm going to have to use my back hand to do that, okay? Right here, okay? That's his right cheek. Well, to do that was what you would do to somebody who was lesser than you, somebody who was not your equal, okay? Well, then Jesus says right, so I slap him here, then he turns, so turn to this, no, turn the other way, okay. Okay, so he turns his other cheek, right? So his other cheek here, here's the dilemma for me as the person slapping him. If I go with my right hand like this, guess what? I'm also, by their customs, I am now considering him an equal, okay? I am now considering him an equal. So this is a way to say, it's a passive way to resist, but it's also something they're not going to want to do to you because it would mean he's on equal footing. We're on equal footing anyway, buddy, but okay. But anyway, so rather than an act of an acceptance, turning the cheek was an act of resistance. But it was not resistance by violence. To offer the left cheek was a way of saying, if you might slap me again, but if you do, you'll have to slap me with that other palm the way you would slap an equal. So turning the other cheek is not about allowing someone to beat you up. Of course you should defend yourself if somebody is doing that to you. And Jesus taught his disciples that you should defend yourself that when you're faced with evil, that we shouldn't either passively ignore it. We see in the temple, when Jesus is cleansing the temple, he's not being passive about it, right? He's very actively engaged in that process. It's not you let anything happen to you, okay? That neither should we respond with vengeful violence. It's not about responding in violence. So we should resist evil, but not by evil means. That's the idea. So when you understand that, I think the ethic that Jesus teaches here is very realistic. Okay, think about Martin Luther King Jr. We've talked a lot about him the last few months, and in January with his holiday, and nonviolent civil disobedience. That was the whole idea behind that, is to resist, but in a nonviolent means. And the bottom line is that violence begets more violence, and Jesus is trying to stop that from happening. Another example that he gives in here is saying go an extra mile. So what did that mean to the people? You got to look back at this time period to see what it meant to the Jewish people. So there was a law that the Romans passed that said if somebody, a Jewish person is working in their fields and a Roman soldier's walking along and soldier points to somebody and says, hey, come over here and carry my bags a mile. By law, they actually had to go for 1 mile and carry that luggage for a mile. So you can imagine if you're a Jewish person in that time period and a Roman citizen or soldier asks you to do that, you would hate that, right? Not only are you subservient to them, but also you're losing some valuable time of work that you could be working in your field or doing whatever you want to be doing, okay? So this is interesting because Jesus then comes along and says, in going just 1 mile, go a second mile. Go a second mile. So you can imagine the people at that time period would have been horrified by that idea. I not only do I have to go 1 mile, but this man is telling me that I should go a second mile. So how can that be good? Well, if you think about it, so the first mile, that slave is doing that. The Jewish person is basically being treated like a slave. They're doing this as a slave for the first mile. They're required to do this. But the second mile, they're doing so by choice. So now it's their choice. So who now is in control? So it's taking away the control of that Roman soldier, that Roman citizen. Now the control is in the hands of the person who is doing the service there. So the first mile was the legal mile. The second mile was a victory mile. So Jesus knew that if they could go the second mile, they were going to get rid of this concept that this person, for one, is an enemy, but also that they were doing this now on their own terms. So it was actually an act that was somewhat freeing, if you think about it. And think about the impact on the Roman citizen or the Roman soldier seeing somebody do this and saying, wow, why did this person choose to do that? They only had to go 1 mile. Why are they going the second mile? And it's no wonder that Christianity spread like wildfire in the first few hundred years after Jesus' death, because this is what people were doing. They were going the extra mile to treat other people well. So what about us? Are we willing to forgive those little things that are done to us? Can we let go when someone insults us or destroys something of ours, something that's really pretty minor? Our current culture and the movies out there tell us to get revenge, right? We love going to movies where there's revenge and there's lots of action, right? We've all probably enjoyed a movie like that. Get them back, right? So God is telling us to let go of that approach. So again, the second mile is a way to show that God is in control of us and that we are not going to let petty things control us. You know, as a teacher, I always deal with a number of sixth graders every year who are victims. They get picked on a lot, you know. And I mean, every year, you know, you tell them the same thing, and there's kids who just get used to being picked on as a victim. And it's like, you know what? Don't respond back. Don't say something back to that kid. You know, let it go. Let it go. And you know what? They're going to leave you alone. And I'm sure we've all seen that with our kids. You've said, hey, just let it go. That they're going to leave you alone because they're going to realize it's not fun anymore to pick on you. Well, it's the same kind of principle here. But for us, we can say that to a kid, but sometimes we have trouble with the same principle. Somebody does something cruel to us. It's hard for us to let go of that. Okay? But Jesus says we are going to actually go the extra mile, and not only should we ignore it, we actually should be trying to do something nice in response. And you can imagine how much that frustrates an enemy. So as we look at this second mile approach, it ties into the last section that we're going to read here about love your enemies as well as your neighbors. So on your bulletin, so should be filling in there, love your enemies as well as your neighbors. So verse 43 says, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbors and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than the others? Do not even pagans do that. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So in the Bible, it was very clear, the Hebrews people, that they were supposed to love their neighbors. And if you look at Leviticus 19:18, it says this very clearly. It says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. However, Jesus comes on the scene here in the Sermon on the Mount and says, you know what? Don't just love your neighbors, but love your enemies as well. And the people of Jesus' time had trouble doing that, much like I think we today have trouble doing that, right? I think it's very natural for humans to love yourselves and love other people who are like you, but it's much harder for us to love or want to be around people who are different than we are. Okay? You don't have to go into a party, crowded party, or go into a room where you might not know any people. You gravitate toward those who are like you, right? It's just natural human inclination to go find somebody who is the most likely like you if you go into that kind of situation. As Jesus says, if we are only good to those who are good, we are no different than anybody else in the world. So Jesus is calling us to this new standard, a new standard for them, which was to love the unlovable, to love those who have hurt us or those who have vowed to go against us. So we are supposed to love those people as if they're our best friend. If you look at this, you love them as your best friend or as if you're their fans. Okay? Not easily done. There's a story from the Revolutionary War about a pastor by the name of Peter Miller. And Peter Miller was a pastor in a rural Pennsylvania area, really beloved pastor. He was known for always doing kind things for the people in his community. He was always very friendly people. People had great things to say about him, except he had one guy named Michael Whitman who was his vowed enemy. Michael Whitman had some things written about Pastor Miller, said bad things about him all the time, made fun of him, just couldn't stand him. Okay, so if Miller had anybody that was his worst enemy, it was this guy named Michael Whitman. Well, Michael Whitman, as it turns out, was kind of associated with some of the loyalists in the Revolutionary War, and he was caught and he was sentenced to death as a traitor. So Michael Whitman is then sentenced to die. So Miller, the pastor, decides that he's going to do something about this. So he takes off. He lived about 60 miles from Philadelphia, and he walks all the way to Philadelphia. And he finds General George Washington, who had sentenced this guy to death. And he goes to George and he says, you know what? I would like you to free this man. And George Washington says, you know, Pastor Miller, this was very admirable that you would walk this distance, you know, to come and try to save your friend. But I'm sorry, I have to follow the law. And at which point Miller cries out, he says, friend, why, that man is the worst enemy I have in the world. And George Washington was greatly taken aback. And he responded, what? Have you walked 60 miles to save the life of an enemy? That puts the matter in a different light. So Washington wrote out a pardon for Whitman for the sake of this magnanimous request by Miller and handed it to Miller himself to deliver. Miller shows up right as they're actually have Whitman on the scaffold. And Whitman had said, oh, here comes Peter Miller. I'm sure he's coming here to enjoy watching me be hanged. And instead, he delivers this pardon. And he and Whitman ended up walking all the way back to their town together. Okay? So can you imagine any of our current day politicians doing this? I don't think in our climate right now we could see that, right? Yeah. So we begin to show God's heart when we're not biased and reach out to help our enemies. I believe that Jesus wants us to have a thicker skin and be quick to forgive. Now, there is an exception to this rule, and God doesn't want us to become a doormat to cross our boundaries time and time again. So if you've had somebody who's deeply hurt you and wounded you to the point that it's very painful for you to even have them in your lives, then it might be something where you have to draw a boundary line and say, you know what, I'm going to forgive you and love you, but I can't have you around me right now because it's too painful. Okay, and there may be, and maybe that's something at some point you can get over. But at the same time, there are sometimes situations in our lives where there's somebody who's hurt us so badly that it would be very unwise for us to bring them back into our lives and forgive them. So there is that. I want to put that little exception out there. So Jesus, he wants to stretch us, though. He wants us to let go of those biases and the pettiness that often hinders us from being loving people. So my challenge to you this week is to show love towards somebody who's unlovable. And maybe that's a colleague at work that gets under your skin. Or maybe that's somebody who just doesn't fit in with the mold of who you usually hang out with or comfortable with. Or maybe just having a cup of coffee with them or having a friendly conversation. And maybe it is that you're going to sit down with somebody that you have had a serious problem with and say, you know what? Well, I know we've had problems in the past. Let's sit down and write out some boundaries of what we can say and do and not do. And we're going to try to repair this relationship. Right? So that's my challenge to you for this week. Think of somebody that you can reach out to that you wouldn't normally reach out to. We went to, for years, we were at Canyon View Vineyard Church, and Dan Cox, who was the pastor there for years, said all the time, he'd say, build a bridge and get over it. Let go of those things that have hurt you, build a bridge and get over it. And that's really, really true in this matter. Loving others just like us doesn't stretch us or push us. So God's love pushes us to another level. And I think you'll be transformed if you do start praying for your enemies or trying to reach out to your enemies. Okay? Even if you don't change them, your heart's going to be changed, your heart for them. And that's what I find is when I start praying for somebody that's hurt me, that my heart's the one that's changed. But hopefully what happens is that person is changed as well. Okay? That's what we can hope for. So we need to go the extra mile to love people back. And, loving others can cause great changes with us, but also within those people. So as it says at the end of this verse there, it says, if we can do this, we can try to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. All right, your last point is don't be self-righteous, but live in freedom. So don't lie, don't be self-righteous, but live in freedom. There are several purposes really behind this Sermon on the Mount. Shalane talked about some things last week, and I have this week some additional things with it. And one of the things that he wants to do is he's trying to push us to go above and beyond. I think what happens is once we become Christians for a while, we can get a little bit complacent. Sometimes maybe a little lazy. We look to, I talked earlier about the rule, my gum rule, and what's the bottom line of a rule, okay? And we sometimes, as Christians, start looking at the bottom line. We say, what's the minimum requirement to make God happy? Am I doing enough that God's happy with me and smiling on me, right? I think we can all fall into that. I think we all do at times. We can kind of develop this checklist mentality. Well, I prayed this morning. I went to church this weekend. I'm good. I'm not going to do anything extra on top of that. Okay? But the Sermon on the Mount makes it clear that we're to strive beyond this checklist mentality. Don't just love your neighbors, love your enemies. Be honest all the time. It's not a conditional honesty. Don't only avoid, Shalane talked last week about murdering. That we don't only avoid physically murdering somebody, but we want to avoid murdering somebody in our heart or saying words that are going to murder somebody, something that is happening way too much right now. Okay? So Jesus wants us to go beyond our comfort levels. But sometimes, again, we get very content, just going through the motions and doing just the minimum. The other purpose here is that Jesus does not want us to become self-righteous. And we can look at the Pharisees, and I always read the Pharisees, and I get this bad taste in my mouth, those evil people. But the reality is, if we aren't careful, we can start becoming just like the Pharisees. Unwittingly, we can start making an unofficial list of what it is to be a good Christian, and we come up with this litany of practices that may be good, but they're never mentioned anywhere as actual requirements for God to love us, right? We might find there might be good things, but we start to unwittingly kind of make these lists. And different churches each have their own lists, right? Here it might be, okay, well, I read my Bible and pray every morning. I go to Alpha. I go to School of Kingdom Ministry. We do outreaches in the community. I go out and do those. I do this. I do that. I don't cuss. So we start making these lists. And then the other danger is we can start telling other people, these are things you can't do, right? And we see this within the Christian community. You might say, well, you can't celebrate Halloween. You can't take yoga class. You can't. So we start coming up with lists of things that really they're nowhere found in the Bible. And so we start making all these extra rules, and we start comparing ourselves with others, and we start saying, well, I'm doing a pretty good job of following the things that people within this church follow. So I must be a good Christian, right? So that's the problem. Okay? Start comparing ourselves, and then we're doing exactly the same thing the Pharisees were doing, trying to measure our spiritual success. So Jesus came along to chastise the Pharisees for adding so much on that no normal person could ever be successful. And that's what we don't want to do either. We don't want to invite people to church and they look and say, wow, I've got to do all these things, or if I'm not doing all these things, I'm not a good Christian. Well, there's a lot more to it than that. Okay? So he wants us to strive to be perfect, but not be consumed all the time counting and checking, trying to be perfect. He calls us to go above and beyond the laws. Okay, he wants us to follow the laws, but go above and beyond. Now, that's a tough challenge, right? To say, you know what, I'm following all these things now. He also wants me to go above and beyond, like he challenges the people in these passages. And here's the thing: is that none of us can do any of these things on our own. And that is why God sent Christ to us, to offer salvation that's built on faith and trust and not dependent on following a set of rules. And worship team, you guys can come on back up here. I can't go a single day without sinning, and there's no way that I can meet his standards by my own effort. On my own, I can't be honest all the time. If Jesus isn't working in my heart, I can't do it. On my own, I don't want to go the extra mile. On my own, I'd rather sit there and flip through, watch some NBA basketball, right? I'm not willing to on my own do that. But God can change my heart so that I want to do that, right? On my own, I will only love my neighbors and I will avoid my enemies. Right? I'll actually avoid them and try not to have any interaction with them. But if we let God do this, God can then change our hearts. So in the Sermon on the Mount, we see he's calling us to a new standard, one where we need to search his heart daily and not become consumed with trying to just measure up. It's a faith based on relationship and freedom, not competition and counting. So we need to strive to be people who are not trying to constantly calculate where we are with God. What we need to work on is surrendering our hearts on a daily basis. So he can help us reach a level that's supernatural, where we do have the ability to reach out and go above and beyond and meet his expectations in ways that are going to please him, and go beyond not just following his laws, but go above and beyond. Only God can transform us into people that live and love at another level. So that's my challenge to you today, to let Jesus take you to where a level that is impossible for you. Remember, it's his blood that saves us. It's not us that save ourselves. So let's be people who go above and beyond what he wants. But we're doing it because Jesus is active and speaking to our hearts. So as we worship here, just reflect on what are some things that you can do. What are some changes on some of these things that you might need to work on? Maybe it is being honest all the time, honest with yourself. Maybe it is that you do need to reach out to somebody who's different than you. Okay, and maybe it is reaching out to somebody who's way different than you and showing love to somebody that you would normally perceive as your enemy. So we'll spend a few minutes up here in worship, and I'll come back up here in a few minutes and close this out.